Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research initiatives at the University of Saskatchewan. One of the programs that I run is called SURE, the Student Undergraduate Research Experience, and it's for undergraduate students who are engaging in a research experience of any kind, whether that's an honors or a capstone project, a FIRE class, or more likely, a summer research assistantship. So the SURE program runs all summer. And it kicked off this past Friday, May 6th, and yesterday we had our first major SURE session from the library about how to do good searching for your literature review. The SURE program has about 50 events coming up throughout the summer, and it's for students who are doing research experiences and would like to have a co-curricular record that sits on their transcript. So I will put a link to the chat. If you're a student who's here, who's doing a research experience and you haven't signed up for the overall SURE program, I bid you welcome, and I'll send you the link to sign up. What we're doing today is how to manage your research data. So what we've done, so I've worked with Kevin Reed at the library before. The last couple of years, Kevin has come to the SURE program and given a presentation on managing your research data and what research data management good practices look like. And so for this year, because the Tri-Councils, so NSERC, SSHRC, and CIHR are looking to have researchers actually create a research data management plan, we thought that we would get ahead of that a little bit by inviting the undergraduate students who are part of the SURE program, who have NSERC USRAs this summer or doing a research project of whatever kind, to come and have a little bit more of a robust program to learn how to write a research data management plan and overall how to manage your research data. So if you're part of the SURE program, that's part of why that could be why you're here. You might be here because your professor signed you up for it, and their professor might be here too. So welcome to all the faculty, welcome to all the students. And with that, I am recording this session. It will be posted on our YouTube channel page, and I'll be sending the link out for that as well. And with that, I am going to pop it over to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks, Merle, and yes, welcome to everyone who is a part of that SURE RDM summer program. And if you're not, welcome too. I'm glad you're here to learn about how to manage your research data. So my name is Kevin Reed, and I'm an associate librarian in the Health Sciences Library. I've been working in research data management support for researchers for about 10 years. And alongside me today is Sarah Rutley, who is also working on this program. And Sarah will be running the chat to make sure that all the questions that you might ask over the course of this hour and a half are answered. So if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to them today. So the learning objectives for today, what we're hoping that you're going to achieve is that by the end of this presentation, you're going to be familiar with research data management and the research lifecycle. You'll be able to describe why managing your data is well worth the effort, to outline what is involved in data management and where to begin, and also to know where to go for help and to learn more so that you can implement data management practices into your research process from the very beginning. So the first thing I want to do is we're actually going to watch a little video. So this was created by coworkers of mine at the NYU Health Sciences Library in the US, and it describes an interaction between a bear and a panda and some of the data management challenges that you might see when working with other researchers or trying to access data. And while we watch this, I want you to think about what are some of the main challenges that are coming across in this discussion between these two figures. So I'm going to switch over and expand this, because what we're going to do once we finish the video is we're going to have you list what are the specific challenges that you saw in this interaction. So here we go.
Hello. My name is Dr. Judy Benign. I'm an oncologist at NYU School of Medicine.
Hello, Dr. Judy Benign.
I read your article on B-cell function. I think that I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer.
I am not an oncologist.
I know, but I think I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer. Do you have the data?
Everything you need to know is in the article.
No. What I need is the data. Will you share your data?
I am not sure that will be possible.
But your work is in PubMed Central and was funded by NIH.
That is true.
And it was published in Science. which requires that you share your data.
I did publish in Science.
Then I am requesting your data. Can I have a copy of your data?
I am not sure where my data is.
But surely you saved your data.
I did. I saved it on a USB drive.
Where is the USB drive?
It is in a box. It is in a box at home. I just moved.
But can I use your data?
There are many boxes. So many boxes. I forgot to label the boxes.
Hello again. Thank you for sending me a copy of your data on a USB drive. I received the envelope yesterday.
You are welcome, but I will need that back when you are finished. That is my only copy.
I did have a question.
What is your question? You might find the answer in my article.
No. I received the data, but when I opened it up, it was in hexadecimal.
Yes, that is right.
I cannot read hexadecimal.
You asked for my data and I gave it to you. I have done what you asked.
But is there a way to read the hexadecimal?
You will need the program that created the hexadecimal file.
Yes, I will. What is the name of the program?
Cytosynth.
I do not know this program.
It was a very good program. The company that made the program went bankrupt in 2007.
Do you have a copy of the program?
I do not use this program anymore because the company that made it went bankrupt. Maybe you can buy a copy on eBay.
I have good news.
You again.
I talked to my colleague. She knew a person with a copy of the software.
Then why do you need me? Everything you need to know about the data is in the article.
I opened the data and I could not understand it.
If you have the program, you will find it is clear.
Well, I noticed that you called your data fields SAM. Is that an abbreviation?
Yes, it is an abbreviation of my co-author's name. His name is Samuel Lee. We call him Sam.
I see. And what is the content of the field called SAM1?
Ah yes, SAM1 is the level of CXCR4 expression.
And what is the content of the field called SAM2?
That is logical if you think about it.
What is the content of the field called SAM2?
I don't remember.
What about SAM3? Is there a guide to the data anywhere?
Yes, of course. It is the article that is published in Science.
The article does not tell me what the field names mean. Is there any record of what these field names mean?
Yes. My co-author knows what the content of SAM2 is, and SAM3. And SAM4.
Can I talk to your co-author?
I'm not sure.
I would very much like to talk to your co-author.
Well, he was a graduate student. He went back to China 2 years ago.
Can I have his contact information?
He is in China. His name is Sam Lee.
I think I cannot use your data.
You could check the article to see if what you need is there.
Please stop talking now.
Okay, so hopefully that gave you some idea of some potential data management challenges that came up. And what I would like us to do is I'm going to share this link into the chat. And so in this case, we have a link here. And what I'd like you to do is on this page, if you double click anywhere on the page, it will bring up a subject line and a description. And so within that, just write a description of some of the things that came to you while watching this video. What were some of the challenges that the panda had in getting access from the data from the bear? And I've heard some people say my audio isn't great, so I'm going to try to remove my headphones and see if that works a little bit better. Okay, so everyone take some time. I shared the link in the chat. What were some of the main concerns that you saw?
interdisciplinary issues, publicly funded versus publicly accessible, inaccessible platforms, only one copy of the data, the author doesn't have a grasp on their own data, the hubris of the bear, excellent, not assigning variable names, no common data language, wonderful. So all of these are really great reasons why there were so many challenges there. Okay, lots there. Trying to get the data in the first place, the fact that the data was on a USB drive and it was the only copy, pretty terrifying if it's important data that you published in a journal like Science, for example. Perfect. Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to go back to, feel free to keep sharing and we can look back to it afterwards, but I'm going to move on to going through the presentation here. So let's start off with what are we talking about when we're really discussing research data management? And hopefully the video gave you a sense of some of those elements. But really, before we start talking about research data management, it's important to get a sense of how are we contextualizing that within the context of research data itself. And research data, as we're defining it, is any information that you might use to collect, generate, or use to validate your research findings. Everyone in this group might be coming from a different perspective or a different discipline. And so data or information that you collect for your research might look very different from another person on this call. And really, data should be the basis for your conclusions or arguments that you use when you're publishing or you're presenting or you're sharing your results of your research. And a bonus part of research data, which we're going to talk about today, is any information necessary for others to be able to understand and use your data, also known as documentation, which we're going to talk a lot about today. So when we think about the types of data, you can really break them down into many different ways, but really what we think of data, you have the quantitative data, which is numerical, which could be anything from geographic coordinates to patient vital signs to environmental measures. And examples might be checking out the number of smokers per province or the pH level in a soil sample. And then we have qualitative data, so textual or non-numerical, meaning it might be audio recordings, it might be free text survey responses, oral histories, and examples of that kind of data might be videos or recordings, or even written stories from community members. Then when we break data down in terms of its type, we have primary data, which means data that you have collected firsthand, it's original, it's never been gathered before. And that could be anything from data you collected observing migratory bird patterns in Argentina, or clinical trial data on the efficacy of a drug. Whereas secondary data is data that actually was collected by someone else and may have already been analyzed and published for other people to use. And you can use that secondary data for your own research. So an example might be using the census from Canada to look and analyze a specific population, or using a data set that was published from another researcher. In this case, the bear would have had a secondary data set that could be used. And then when we think about the types of data by stage, we have raw data, so data that exists at the point of collection, so the first time that you've collected it. Usually this is unaltered and could also be secondary data. So in this case, someone else's secondary data may be our original raw data. From there, what we might do is we might process that data so it's easily more understood or better prepared for analysis. And you can include data where personal identifying information has been removed. So what we're doing is we're creating a subset of our data because that's where our interest lies and we want to examine it further. And then finally, we have analyzed data, which is data that has gone through some sort or many types of analysis. These are often dependent on types of software. So some of you may be familiar with tools like R or SPSS or SAS. And this is what you would commonly see reported in a publication. So analyzed data often results in figures or tables that are put into a publication for use. But at every stage, your data is going through a different process and it's changing. And so making that data understandable is really important. So when it comes to research data management, the focus that we want to talk to you about today is really data management is the planning, maintenance, and documentation of all aspects of your data during a study or throughout a research project. And if you do data management well, it should help you organize and keep track of your data, to be able to use and understand your data, and to preserve and share your data for the long term. So not just that you can access it a week from now, but 5 years from now, you could go back to your data and actually understand what you did and remember what you did because your documentation is so strong. So when we think about data over the course of the research lifecycle, there are many different types of life cycles, and this is what we're going to use today. Often the focus traditionally has been on that final publication. So if we think about the publication as the tip of the iceberg, sure, we get a description of the methods and the results of the paper, but we don't necessarily get to see all the other elements that might go into creating that publication. Whether that's our protocol, it's a data collection plan, it's the software we used, it's the equipment we use to collect the data, it's how we analyze the data. And really what data management is trying to do is make sure that all of that information goes above the surface alongside the publication as well. So when we think about data management, why is it important and why should you bother? And there are many reasons why, and one of them, as Merle had mentioned at the beginning, and why many of you are participating in this particular summer program, is that it's now becoming a requirement. So if you are funded by the CIHR, by NSERC or SURE, they expect if you are applying for grant funding that you will A, submit a data management plan describing how you're going to document and manage your data over the course of the project, as well as where you're going to deposit it so it's easily accessible for you and others for the long term. We also know beyond government policy that publishers are now expecting you to share your data. So one of the first examples of this was PLOS in 2014, who released a data sharing policy that said, if you refuse to share the data underlying your publication and you don't show proof that you've shared, we will not accept your article, no matter how good the science is. Similarly, if you say you're going to share your data and then you remove it later, they will immediately retract your article as well. And we're seeing a lot of journals start to create these policies because they expect that alongside the publication, you're going to have well-described and shared data. We also have seen now that there's an issue around reproducibility in research. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this concept, reproducibility is the ability to follow or implement the same experiments using the same data and tools to get the same results. So I should be able to look at your paper and everything I follow in that paper should be reproducible based on what you said. But a lot of studies recently have highlighted the fact that many high-profile research studies that have led to new drug treatments, for example, could not be recreated at all, specifically in psychology. And the main reason for this was a lack of transparency, incomplete reporting, so the authors were not describing everything they did, and really poor documentation. So even if people who were doing these studies could gain access to all the tools that those researchers used, they didn't know how to use them in accordance with how it was published in the paper. So here we're seeing a huge data management gap simply because people aren't reporting and describing what they're doing accurately. We also know that data management can have major consequences on research. So this is a blog post from a blog called Retraction Watch, which highlights reasons why different journals and different journal articles get retracted. And in this case, we had a researcher who when he was a postdoc, ran into issues with his data management. And when people came to access his data later, he couldn't actually find it. So when he was preparing his figures for his paper, he wasn't able to replicate the experiments because he couldn't find the original data. And the main reason why was data management and general lab organization problems. So because of these really simple issues that could have been fixed, this researcher had to have 4 papers retracted because of it. So this is almost like your cautionary tale, warning sign of the worst case scenario if you do data management poorly. We also know that there are studies that show that as soon as you publish a paper, that data begins to lose value almost immediately. So in the highlighted graph here we see on the one side, we see the slow decline of the value of data over time. And the reason for this is because authors aren't responding to particular emails, they've lost the data, it's not saved in formats that is usable, and that causes a lot of issues and a lot of challenges. And so what we're trying to get you to think about and to avoid is that you come to the end of your project and this is what's left. a giant mess that you haven't necessarily thought about in terms of how it's organized, how it's described. And in talking with many faculty here on campus and in my previous roles, a lot of them regret not doing the work up front, even as when they were graduate students, because they went back to the research 5 years later as a faculty member and couldn't understand what they did. So the goal here is to keep you thinking about, how do I set the stage for data management throughout this entire process? So I want to start with a really simple example of where data management can go wrong. And I like to use this recipe for Heavenly Pie by a woman named Mrs. R.D. Sycophus. So here you can see we have an example of the Heavenly Pie recipe where we have ingredients and we have instructions. So if we were to think about the final product, which is that Heavenly Pie, as a published article, let's think of all of the ingredients and the recipe as the methods and data. Now, take a look at this recipe for a second and think about what are some of the issues that you might find in this recipe. And when we think about it, if we're comparing it to what methods and data might be like in a presentation, we first have pretty poorly described methods and unclear data. So in terms of the data, I have 2 egg whites, I have 2 ripe bananas, I have a quarter of chopped nuts, and I'm told to put it in a shell, put cream and chopped nuts on top. So am I whipping the egg whites? Am I cutting the bananas up? What kind of nuts am I using? Am I chopping them finely? Am I not chopping them finely? If I was to do this as instructed, I would have a bunch of raw egg whites, 2 giant bananas, and some chopped nuts in a shell of indiscriminate size. So the point here for you to think about is that what it's important to think about is describing this in a way that someone else would be able to very clearly understand what you did and how you did it. So let's think about data management throughout the research lifecycle. And before I do that, are there any questions people have at this point? I see there's a couple chat messages. Perfect, thanks, Tony. Okay. So when we think about the research lifecycle, there are many things going on. And I want you to reflect back on the specific iceberg model that I showed you earlier. At the hypothesis planning stage, you're developing your research question, you might be looking at literature, you're outlining your hypothesis. At the study design phase, you're building your methods and methodology, you might be drafting a protocol, and hopefully you'd be creating some kind of plan for how you're going to manage that data, which we'll talk about later. When you're collecting your data, you're organizing it, you're documenting the process, you're storing it somewhere, and then you're preparing it to be analyzed. And then you're analyzing data, documenting your findings. Hopefully, if you're using any type of software or code, you're keeping track of that. And then finally, you're publishing your results. So you're generating your figures, you're finalizing that data, and you're compiling the documentation to be shared. This is what ideally data management looks like over the course of your entire project. So it should document what you do, as well as organizes all of these things as you go. So not at the very end when you're hitting the publishing stage, but from the very beginning of the process, you're already thinking about this. So what's really important to think about is that your data can be useful to others. And so this is a rubric or a matrix that was drafted by a colleague of mine at Stanford named John Borghi. And what it does is it highlights the different ways that researchers tend to approach different stages of that research lifecycle. So whether you're planning a project to sharing and publishing your data, most people fall into these 2 categories, either doing so ad hoc or one time. So maybe someone's showed interest in their research and the researcher scrambles and gets all of the things together in order to share it with that one person. But what I want you all to think about is that ultimately data management should be pushing you into this direction. So you're being more active and informative, and you're actually optimizing your data for reuse. So when you're planning a project, rather than you just having a way of doing things, you're actually thinking about creating a plan to streamline future use of your research, not only for yourself, but for others. So what I want you to do is take a moment here. We're going to have a little bit of a self-assessment activity and review each row and identify the description that best fits your current practices. And I acknowledge that not everyone on the call has probably been immersed in research as much as others have. So think about even your own general work practices when you're doing an assignment or you're studying for something. Where would you think that you fall under these 4 categories in terms of how you either approach your research or your work more generally. And then we're going to have a little fun exercise after this as well. I cannot make it larger, Merle. I'm sorry. And if anyone's feeling brave and is able to look through them, feel free to share where you feel you fall in the chat. Some groups feel braver than others, so we'll have another opportunity to do this anonymously in a second. Okay, great. Perfect. Okay. Excellent. So what I'd like to do then, instead of thinking about, as you think about putting yourself in this context, another way that I find can be quite helpful for people to think about, or at least assess in more of a fun way, where they feel they fall in terms of the data management process, is what I want to do. Hold on, my screen is, I want to go back to a new Padlet, and what I'd like you to do is enter a GIF that you think best describes your current research data or work practices. And for you to do so, what I'd like you to do is you can click on the plus sign at the bottom of the screen, and in the little pink area here on the right-hand side, the pink shape, you can click on it, and then from there, you can select GIF right on the right-hand side. So just to do that one more time, pink plus sign, pink button here, and then choose the orange GIF sign on the right-hand side. And provide a GIF that best describes your practices. Okay, some people feeling confident. That's good. I like that. Amazing. We always see lots of variation in this. Oh, geez, some quite far gone. So I definitely feel like Kermit a lot of the time, I have to say, when it comes to my data. Amazing, excellent. This is so good. I will, everyone, please keep them coming, and I'm happy to share these with everyone, the link after it's over, just so we have a picture of this, because it's it's fantastic. So yeah, a little bit of a mix of confidence, of fear, of accepting the inevitable, of some representations of death, which is concerning. But at the same time, hopefully by the end of this, and if you're part of this program, you're going to feel much more comfortable going forward. Okay, excellent. So let's go back. So let's talk now that we know where you stand and how you feel about your current practices. We're really going to focus on what good data management looks like in practice. And we're going to go through each of these stages, and they include developing a data inventory, having good documentation for your data, having good file organization, making sure your data is stored and preserved, making sure that it's shared if possible, and then finally, all of that's going to culminate in a data management plan, which is really the main focus of what we're talking about. So let's start with the first step, which is creating a data inventory. And the goal of a data inventory is really just a chance for you, when you're starting, or even if you want to start mid-project, what is all the different things involved in your research project? So the first question is, what are the types of data you are collecting? So you want to think about what we looked at before, whether it's primary data, secondary data, is it quantitative, is it qualitative? What is the specific elements of it? Is it metadata, as one person mentioned to me in the chat? What are the file types that are being generated? Are these file types usable by other people? How stable is your data? So are you creating many, many versions? Are you updating it on a regular basis? How much data are you going to be generating? Do you need 100 terabytes of data, or is it something relatively simple that you don't need to worry about? And then finally, this gets to the idea of documentation. What other information would be necessary to understand your data? So is that protocols, templates, survey instruments, questionnaires, your interview guide, code, software, or tools? All of these things are going to help make your research data more understandable overall. So this is just an example of a really simple way that you could build a data inventory. But again, it's going to give you that full picture of all the different elements that make up your research process. So you can make sure where you have gaps and what you need more clarity on as you work through this process. So once the data inventory comes into play, I really want to focus on this last bit, which is the other information necessary to understand the data. And I want to highlight some key elements that you want to think about when it comes to data documentation. So when you start a research project and you're thinking about your data, these are the key considerations you should be thinking about. Is my data going to make sense to somebody else? Will someone else understand how I actually collected that data? Does it reveal anything about who it was collected from, which we'll talk about in terms of sensitivity and whether or not you can share it? And can I ethically and legally share this data? So in terms of documentation, the first thing you want to do, and you're probably already doing this in some way, is describing your methodology. So where is your data coming from? Is it coming from an environment, from a person, from an animal, from a text, for example? How are you collecting it? So how are you gathering that information? What are you measuring, testing, or examining? And then what software programs or tools are you using to work with that data? So don't only think of that as, oh, I'm using SPSS, or oh, I used SurveyMonkey. Think about the version of that particular software you're using, because someone else might want to try and use your data later on or gain access to it and not be able to because they're not familiar with how your data was created at that moment. So one of the best things you can do, especially when it comes to writing a publication and sharing additional information, is to build a data collection plan. So actually describe to me, whether in writing or in a visual, what is happening over the course of your project. Visualization turns out to be a really great way to communicate a lot of detailed information in a way that's digestible to someone who might not be readily familiar with your research. And so by doing that, it's giving them a picture of all the stages of collection, where your data is going, who it's being collected from over the course of that project. Similarly, let's say you're working with your data itself. Is that data going to be understandable to others? So here I'm showing you an actual snippet from a spreadsheet of an NYU researcher who lets me share this for the purpose of this class. And you can see here that if I was to receive this data, let's say I'm the panda, this is what I got from Bear, I have no idea what P1 or P2 or P3 means, or what the number 1 value is, or what active or inactive means. And so ultimately, without any documentation, this data is useless to me because I don't know what's being measured, I don't know how it's being measured, and I don't even know what it pertains to. And so when you're documenting your data, think about defining it so that others understand what you're doing. List your variables and provide definitions of what they mean. How are they represented? Like looking at text, is it a scale, is it a number or a category? And what are the units of measure for specific variables? So one of the ways that you can do this, if you're working with tabular data, is to build a data dictionary. So what you can see here is just an example of variable names. So oftentimes we make shortened variable names, which might not be easily understandable. But what this does is give you an opportunity to define each of those, to describe what type of variable it is. And if you have any type of numerical values, you simply are describing what they are. So in this case, we know that 1 means yes, 2 means no, and then 8 means I don't know. So we are seeing here a very easy depiction of how to make any type of spreadsheet data more understandable to somebody else, so that when you were to give it to them, this would accompany it naturally. And then the last thing you can do in terms of documentation that's a really simple lift is simply create a README file. So best practices are, if you have a data file that's complex and complicated, you can build a simple text file that describes what it is. So it can be a short description of the data, how you collected that data, information related to the software, who was involved in the creation of it. And then that way, anytime that data is shared, that README file is there so that someone can easily open that and understand what they're looking at. So a very simple, low-level lift for providing additional context about any data that you have. So any questions about documentation at this point before we move on? I just want to take a bit of a breath and see if anyone have comments or questions. Okay. If they come up, feel free to put them in and Sarah will be monitoring them. Ooh, I see one. Okay. So keeping your files organized. One of the main parts of data management, and really something that seems so obviously simple to many people, is file organization. But oftentimes it's one of the main reasons that data gets lost because people aren't necessarily thinking about where their data is going and how it's being structured and organized when it's being saved on their files. So in this case, when we think about file organization, you want to be specific about separating your data, your methodology, and your manuscript as well. So general good practice for file organization is use one directory per project, use separate folders for your raw data, your process data, your code, and any specific outputs, so things that you would be willing to share, whether it's via publication or elsewhere. You want a file naming plan. You want to make your original raw data read-only. And then again, as we just discussed, include a README file within each folder so people know what's in there. And file naming, again, seems like a pretty mundane thing, but is oftentimes where people start to go wrong and lose their data. So here we have an example of a file name, and we have what looks like a description of what's in the file, and we have a date attached to it. So what date do we think that is in the chat, if you were to share it? So if we were to look at this date, what do people think this date is, if you were to share that in the chat? Okay. We've got some January 26th, we have some December 6th. And so within that, what we're seeing here is we're starting to create some ambiguity, and we want to avoid that, right? So are we looking at June 12th? Are we looking at December 6th? Are we looking at January 26th? And so when we're thinking about file naming, we want to be consistent and clear. And so when it comes to dating any files, which is always a good idea because it keeps track again of when the last time you updated it was or when it was created, you want to use the year, month, day rule, which is part of a standard. So I have a link here to an ISO standard so that everyone understands that year, month, day is the clear way to approach this file naming practice. Also, when it comes to file naming, you want to be descriptive. So I just saw in the chat someone share what they did, and that's excellent, right? Bad would be file.txt. I don't know what that means. Versus 2018-09-20 mouse weight, I know that this is likely was collected in September 20th of 2018, and it's going to hold data about the weight of mice. You also want to be consistent so that it's easily sortable. Also, if you're importing it into any software, it's going to be easy to organize very, very quickly. You also want to avoid abbreviations and spacing where possible. So really what I've found is that when you start to create complex abbreviations for your files, no one's going to understand them. And the likelihood is that if you return to your data a year from now, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to either. So generally you want to use dashes, underscores, numbers, and letters only. So also avoid special characters if you can. Again, stick to letters, numbers, and underscores as you go through. And version control is important too. So let's say one of the questions you might have is, well, I'm going to be creating about 100 files related to the specific experiment. And so when you think about it being sorted, knowing that you have 100 files allows you to create some space in there to make sure that your data is going to be organized accordingly. Because if I don't account for that additional numeric value, what's going to happen is it's all going to get out of whack. So in this case, because I didn't put 2 zeros in front, it's putting the 10 after the 1 instead of where it should be. So you always want to be thinking about how are my files going to be extensible going forward. Okay, so any comments or questions about that? One thing I wanted to mention was someone shared in the chat with me that all of the information we were talking about before, which are these specific questions about related to what you're documenting, is also known as metadata. So metadata is simply data about data. And so in this case, the metadata that you're keeping is keeping track of all the different descriptive elements about your data set themselves. So that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Kevin, there was a question in the chat. It got posted right before everyone else posted their responses, so I got a bit worried. But the question was around if there are any sort of tried and true methods for estimating how much space you might require, other than doing what I just frantically did, which was Googling how to best estimate storage needs for data. I don't know if that's something you want to speak to now, or I just wanted to flag it.
It's a good question, and I personally haven't seen any particular best practices, and I think unfortunately a lot of it comes with experience. So like, let's say you're doing interviews and you're recording for an hour and you're starting to get familiar with how big those file types are. It's hard necessarily to know, but I often say it's better to recommend and be more ambitious with how much space you think you need rather than be conservative. And so one of the things that I often recommend people do is that they talk to IT, for example, when they're starting a research project, to say, here's what I'm expecting to start collecting. And I'd like to have a conversation about expectations around how much data that might be. And Sarah, I don't know if you identified anything else that you might want to share there that you identified.
Not in particular, other than it's a bit higher level, more general, but just making sure that you're accounting not only for sort of the base data that you collect, but also any versioning that you do, also any backups you plan to create. So as Kevin said, it's better to estimate a little higher than to really restrict it to exactly how much you think you might collect. And I see that we've also got a hand up from Michelle. If I assume participants are able to unmute.
Yes, just related to the file ordering that Kevin was showing a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
To make a long story short, there was a piece of a macro command that was published for all organic chemists to use, and we're not computer scientists. Most of us just use the code blindly. And it turns out that the file ordering, it was realized years later, was giving a different file order. I think it's exactly related to what you were showing, writing 0, 1 instead of 1, a different file order, whether you're on a Windows computer or Linux or a Mac. And so that means, and that was published perhaps 7, 8 years later. So there was an article that was published saying that the past 8 years or so of papers and data that use this piece of code would need to be rechecked to make sure the conclusions are correct.
Yeah, for a simple file naming issue. So thank you for sharing that. It's where we often think file management is such a simple thing, like, oh, it's easy, no big deal, but it can have huge consequences. And without it, it leads to a lot of human error. And so thank you for sharing that, Michelle.
But beyond that, I just wanted to point out that the file ordering may be different on a Mac and a PC, so you have to keep that in mind as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, I'm seeing some other questions, and I think I might save some of these to the end because they might help be answered as we go through. But great questions, everybody, so far. Okay, so once we get through file organization, now it comes to the actual idea of storing and preserving your data. And really what you want to think about when you're planning your data storage is, where is your data going to live throughout the project? You want to plan out what's going to happen to your data when collecting or moving it ahead of time. So for example, you might have your data stored in a software program during the collection phase, but you might take it out and move it to a statistician later on. And so you want to be considerate of who is going to be responsible for that data at different stages of the project and track where that data is going to live to make sure that it's exactly what you said before. What software is going to be used for it? What are the needs that you're going to have in order to be able to use that data effectively? And again, the data inventory comes into play here because you should have a good sense of how much storage you need and what the data is, as well as that documentation. So when we think about the research lifecycle, maybe your data is living in different places at different stages, and you want to be accountable for that. And you want to make sure that you're tracking that so that the seamless movement of your data from one place to another, if that needs to happen, is being done accordingly. So always be aware of where that data is going to go and how it's going to be stored. It's also really important to know, and so let's refer back to the video at the start of this presentation. Just because you store your data somewhere doesn't mean that it's being preserved for the long term. So for example, the Bear had all of their data on a USB drive, and it was their only copy of data. That is not preservation, right? And it's extremely risk averse. If that data gets lost or it gets in a box that the Bear can't find, we're basically out of luck in terms of being able to recreate or reuse that data. And so really what preservation is trying to get you to think about is to protect your data from both hardware obsolescence and software obsolescence. So I like to show these two examples. On the left-hand side, we have a colleague of mine's PhD thesis in neuroscience that is available on a Jazz drive. So how many of you, by a show of hands, have heard of a Jazz drive before? Okay, I got one hand up. A couple people, okay. Good. So we have 2 out of 70 who have heard of a Jazz drive. And that's kind of my point, because my colleague hasn't been able to access her work on this Jazz drive for years because she doesn't have the hardware to be able to open it on her computer. Similarly, on the right-hand side, I have some work from my graduate studies where I used a proprietary piece of software where I didn't transfer over the format. And every time I try to open it in a new program, this is what I get. I get a bunch of jumbled mess that I can't recreate. And so what you're trying to think about when it comes to preservation is, how can I make sure my data is going to be accessible and usable for the long term? And so when we think about file formats, we have here a few examples of proprietary on one side. So Microsoft, of course, is been around for a long time and a lot of people use it. But if you want your data to be read exactly as how it's stored, you may want to consider creating open file formats, or at least a copy of those for yourself. All of these open formats can be opened by any program at any point from now into the future. They are an international standard. And so the way I like to pose this question is, if your data is extremely important to you and you always want to make sure it's available, you better be saving at least one copy in an open format. And so again, think about this continued value of your research over time. If you publish something or you give a presentation and your data is stored on a strange hardware format or in bad software formats, it's immediately losing value right away. And so what I always recommend people do is protect your raw data. Have one master copy that is in a CSV file, for example, and then you can make as many copies as you want and start to build subsets in different proprietary software. But the important thing is that if you lose one of these process data copies, the master data is always there to be recreated and redone. So you always want to save one copy in a specific format to make sure that it's always going to be around for you as you move forward. There's also the 3-2-1 rule. So keep at least 3 copies of your data, store 2 backup copies on different devices or storage systems, and keep at least 1 backup copy offsite. So why might I want to keep more than 1 copy or keep a copy offsite? In the chat, anyone want to share why they might do that? Fire, yes, absolutely. If your house burns down. Flood, exactly. So I used to work at NYU and I was there during the time of Hurricane Sandy. And even though some of the faculty had their data stored on their computers as well as on laptops, the hurricane came through and wiped out all the labs and people lost years and years of their data because it was all stored in the same place. So you definitely want to be thinking about, how can I make sure my data is protected, my data is safe. We work so hard to collect it. We spend all our time focusing on it. So you want to be able to protect it. And obviously IT is doing some of that backup for you, but it's always good to keep another copy for yourself that's redundant of what you already have so that it's available for you elsewhere. OneDrive as well is meant to be backup according to ICT, so it's backed up in multiple locations offsite, but I don't necessarily have the details on that, and that's what we are assured of. However, again, getting more details from ICT is probably a good idea. And that's a good point. If your data, raw data is tens of terabytes, keeping that many copies is near impossible, and that's why when you're working or paying for specific storage, you want to make sure that those systems have a backup solution for you. So if you're paying for Amazon Cloud Service or you're paying through ICT, you want to know the details of backup so that if something's lost locally, it can be recovered somewhere else. So good points to raise there. Okay. So when it comes to, we've built an inventory, we have a good sense of what our data is and everything that needs to be involved in it. We've documented our data, it's organized in a file structure we can easily access, it's stored and preserved for the long term. Now we come to one of the parts of the tri-agency policy that's being asked about, which is sharing. And so when we talk about sharing your data, there are many things that are involved. Not all of us can share, and that's important to think about. But what I want to show you in this section is what's available to you, as well as some considerations you might think about, whether or not you can share your data more generally. So when we think about research data management and the research process, ultimately, when we get to the end, we want to be able to share a paper, our data if possible, and the methodology and documentation or metadata that we were describing about before. And so if you want to share your data, you can use what's called a data repository. And there are many different kinds of data repositories, whether they be institutional, cross-disciplinary, or discipline-specific. So there are repositories that look only at zebrafish, for example, and there are others that are more general purpose and bring in all different kinds of research. And what's important is that you get an understanding of when you select the repository, what is it you want the repository to do? Is it to preserve your data? Is it to provide access to others or simply to store? Not all of them do all of these things. And so before you select an option and you have certain expectations of where your data might go, you want to make sure it's doing and has policy around what you want. So if it's preservation specific, you want to make sure they have backups and that they're focusing on the preservation aspect versus access, making sure that it's getting distributed to the people that you want it to be. So there are many options to share your data. One of the main ones that's been released more recently is specific to Canadian data sharing, and that is the Federated Research Data Repository. So this is a newer repository that's being released that is focusing and encouraging the deposit of Canadian research data. So you could use this repository both to find data as well as to share your own. Whereas if you are looking to share more specifically with your community, or you know that your research community shares in a specific place, there is a registry called Retrievable, which will allow you to isolate and find examples of data repositories in your specific discipline. So the important thing to ask yourself is if you are going to share your data, I recommend that you choose a place where your community already is. So it's easy for them to find, they know where that's where they're going to look for it. And so always focus on the discoverability of your data to the people who you want to see it. Now, as Merle had mentioned in some of the chat a little bit before, not all data can or should be shared. So does the data reveal anything about who it was collected from? And can you ethically and legally share the data that you have? And so, for example, the most important things to check before you share is, are you permitted to share your data publicly? So if you're working with human participants, did you get their consent to share the data publicly? If you're working with a private organization, will they accept you sharing data that might be proprietary? Do you have a license to do that? If restrictions are placed on your data, what conditions would someone else need to meet to use your data? So examples might be they have to go through ethics approval. They might have to fill out a data request application. They might have a use agreement which only allows them to do certain things with your data, or a license, or community participant approval. And so what's important is that whether you can share or not, you describe what would someone need to do to gain access. And so there are many reasons why you can't share, and mainly it's because it might be harmful to a participant or to a company you might be working with. And so when you're working with specific communities, for example, like Indigenous communities, there are often specific guidelines and frameworks that you can use to help inform you about how to work with these communities and how to be responsible with the data. So if you're working with Indigenous communities, for example, there is the OCAP principles, which focus on the ownership, control, access, and possession that that community has over their data. Similarly, there's the CARE principles of Indigenous data governance, which dictate how you should actually be storing and managing the data from these communities while you're conducting research with them. So I highly recommend you take a look at these because they really are guiding principles for how you should be sensitive to the communities that you work with. And then if you can share, it's important to make it usable. So as I showed you before, in a few examples, we have a lot of examples of data that is not useful. And there's this great article from the New England Journal of Medicine that talks about avoiding data dumpsters towards the equitable and useful data sharing. So as people start to comply with these different policies, the challenge that we're seeing is that they're not releasing any useful documentation or metadata whatsoever. So if you share, what you want to be doing is thinking about the data collection instruments, the documentation, and the software. So again, I just want to reiterate this to bring it home. This is a really important facet of what data management is. So when it comes to the publication, all the additional data management material comes with it. And if you can, the data gets shared in that repository. Okay, I'm going to stop because I see some comments in the chat. Great.
I could raise one question and address it quickly.
Sure.
We had a question a while back that was, I think it's a really complex question, and I don't think I'll answer it fully, but it was, how do we ensure personal freedom in choosing how to manage data within the good guidelines, and I think they're referring to the good laboratory practice guidelines, and consistency within one lab. So I think it's totally, I don't have a science background, but I can say that the first thing I'd say is that data management plans aren't necessarily meant to sort of override your existing data practices. They're meant to help you reflect on them and make them explicit. So if you're using a specific set of guidelines within your lab, that's something that can be reflected in your data management plan. And the other thing I would say is just that your data management plan can help you sort of define those roles and responsibilities where you might have discretion to manage your data in your own way, and where there are lab level sort of agreed upon practices that everyone agrees to do. So I know it's a bit of a half answer, but it's a complex question. Yeah.
And I think even the fact that you're using the good practices is a piece of documentation, right? It shows that you're following an existing standard and guideline, and that gets incorporated too, right? So thinking about standards of practice actually should help you with the data management process because they're already giving you those guidelines for how to act responsibly for your experiments or for how you're approaching your research. So it's a really great question. Okay, so all of these things is to say and to culminate in a data management plan itself. So this is where it comes to actually building that plan. For those of you who are a part of this program, this is really what you're going to be focusing on doing over the course of the summer as you work through with us to do this. And so a data management plan is really there to describe, as we've already discussed, how you're going to manage your data across all stages of the life cycle, from the hypothesis stage down to data dissemination. And really, it's a final document that guides how you're going to produce your data, how you're going to produce the documentation at each of these stages. And it's designed to make the data understandable to you and to others. So think about the inventory, our documentation, our organization, our preservation, and our sharing, all sort of culminating in this final plan as we work through it. And so what we're going to do and what you're going to do as part of data management plan is there are existing tools already available for you to do this, which is wonderful because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And it's called the Dmp Assistant. And what the Dmp Assistant does is essentially take you through every stage of data management, from the collection process to documentation to storage, and it asks you questions that you can fill out and enter specifically into these fields and then download it. So I'm going to show it to you now, actually, as we go through. There's all our GIFs again. So when it comes to the Dmp Assistant, hold on a second. It's available right here, and you can log in with your email address and password. And I'm actually going to switch over to another account. But what I want to do is focus on creating an account. So what I'd like you all to do today, I'm going to share this in the chat as one of our activities, is I'd like you to go in and create your own account, and then we'll come back. And what we'll do is we'll go through the process together to show you the details of what this looks like in person. So everyone has a link. If you're a part of the SURE RDM program or not, you can create an account right here, and now you'll be set up with the Dmp Assistant in real time. So I'm just going to take a second, and I'm going to stop sharing so that I can log in myself. Okay. I see something in the chat. Oh, perfect. It's Sarah. So we'll just give everyone another minute to do that. And if once you're done, you could just give a thumbs up as a reaction, then we'll know if everyone's set up. Okay, I'm seeing quite a few.
Maybe another minute or so is
Okay.
half, I think.
Okay, perfect.
I do see one hand raised, and I just wonder if that's a question. Feel free to ask it, but it may have been an alternative thumbs up.
I'll wait on you, Sarah, to let me know when you think it's good to go.
Great, just confirming. Okay, thank you. Well, someone's having trouble with the "I am not a robot."
Are you a robot? Ask Mohammed.
Maybe.
Okay. Well, if people are still struggling, you don't necessarily need to have a sign in right now, but because you'll have the video. The important thing is I just want to make sure that anyone who's a part of the RDM summer program is able to gain access to this, because you're going to need it to submit your data management plan eventually. But I'll just go ahead and at least start giving you a little bit of an overview of this, and then we can play around with it afterwards, or if you have questions, we can take time at the end. So once you've signed in to the Dmp Assistant, you're going to see a dashboard of any projects that you've created. And what's really great is that if you have registered with the University of Saskatchewan, anyone who chooses to make their data management plans public will be seen here. So again, thinking about openness and sharing, as we've been been talking a little bit about in this session, is a chance for you to also see what other people are doing. And so if you want to create a new plan, you simply create the new plan button here. You title your project. So this is what you would title your summer project. And then again, I can say, I want to be from the University of Saskatchewan, and it should pop up automatically. You'll then see that there's a data management plan templates. And what I'd like you all to just stick with for now is the basic template. You're welcome to explore the other ones. There's everything from systematic reviews to qualitative health sciences research to arts-based research. But just for now, we're going to focus on the general portage template. So from there, I'm going to create a plan. And this is where you would type in project title, an abstract. If you have funding information, this is where you would put it. And if your project is in the planning process, if it's been funded or denied, and the grant number. On the next side, there is the contributors list. So you can add as many contributors as you want to your data management plan. I know some of you who are a part of this program are going to be working in teams. So this is a chance for you to all create a plan together. So one person can be responsible for adding those. There's then a little bit of a description on every element of the plan. And then you actually write your plan in this section here. So as we went through today in this session, you have questions about data collection, and you can scroll down and you can type in your answers into here. And then you scroll down and continue to work through each one. And you'll see that there's actually guidance on the right-hand side too. And then once you've completed it, you can either choose to share your plan with the organization. This is where you would actually see it at the USask level, or you can keep it private or make it public, and then you can download it. So if you were applying for a grant for any of you faculty on board, you could simply download your whole plan as a PDF or a CSV and upload that to the grant process if you were being asked to do so. So I see there's some chat comments. Perfect. Okay, Sarah's answering. Great. So just to give you a sense, I recommend that you play around with it, and there's actually going to be some instructions here in a second for those of you part of the program anyways. So in terms of next steps for those of you who are part of the RDM SURE summer program, so you've signed up with your faculty member or your professor, what we want you to do is, after this session, create a project in the Dmp Assistant for your summer project and select the default template. What we'd like you to do before the workshop on May 25th is meet with your supervisor and ask them any questions from the Dmp Assistant to help you start to build that data management plan. You're also going to be receiving a brief survey from us the Monday before the workshop, basically asking about any challenges that you had in terms of questions that you feel like you can't answer or you need more clarity about, because what we're going to do is go over those in the workshop to make sure that we're answering all the issues that you might be struggling with. And then be prepared to come to the workshop with at least a rough draft or a partially completed data management plan. We have 2 whole hours on the 25th where you're going to be able to work on this with our guidance and instruction over filling out each part of the plan itself. So just keep that in mind, but this is a chance for you to get a little bit ahead of that by having that conversation with your supervisor, because they're going to help you guide the types of questions you might be answering. Okay. Also, for those of you who are not part of the program, or if you are, there's still lots of great resources out there that you can use to get more help. So we have a research guide available at the institution through the library that you can access. I have a link to the assistant tool just in case that you didn't have access to it before. If you're curious about seeing other examples of good data management plans, there's this third option, which are exemplars, which show you completed data management plans, which could give you inspiration for filling them out yourself. There's also some best practices for managing your data, how to create a data dictionary, which we talked about today. And if you're curious about learning more about working with Indigenous populations, there's the OCAP training link here as well. If you're looking for other support on campus, there is research computing, as well as Chaser, which is with funding, can support your data collection, processing, analysis, and reporting. And if you have any questions or concerns about your data storage, research computing are really the people who are going to help you not only assess how much data you might have, but where it should go based on the type that it is. And so with that, you can also contact your librarian. If you don't know who they are, you can look through them by subject. But for anything related to the specific program that we're working in, or if you have specific questions, you're welcome to ask me. I will be answering any questions you have about building a data management plan or incorporating this into your work more generally. So with that, I'm going to take a pause. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left for questions if people have them. I'm seeing lots in the chat. We will be distributing the slides absolutely after the presentation. And I'll just take a moment here and see if there are any questions people have. If people want to share their concerns or feelings about incorporating data management into their process. And thanks so much to all of you who've been sharing and were willing to share your gifts and your current practices too. We really appreciate it. So I'll keep the chat open. And see.
We've got a question here from Ellen. It's a really good question. It asks, do you know how much detail will be required for Tri-Council grant applications on DMPs going forward as a new requirement? And also, as a side question, will this software generate a proper statement that can be used in applications?
Right, so that's a great question. So currently, I'm a part of the Data Management Planning Advisory Committee that does have Tri-Council membership on it. And they have not released any specificity as to what a good versus a inadequate data management plan looks like. The only information I can provide right now is that it's going to be sort of a pass-fail grade. It won't be scored in the way the other parts of your grant would be. And the PDF output that you download from the Dmp Assistant is acknowledged as being a fine file format to be uploaded into the grant itself. Also really important to mention that some of the elements of a data management plan may overlap with your ethics application. And so when it comes to ideas about ethical and legal implications of your data, you can often repeat what you've written in your ethical application in the data management plan itself.
We've also got, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all.
We've got a question from Alana asking, we hire someone to do our transcribing for our research projects. Would they have to be included within the data responsibility portion despite having no stewardship over the data and them signing an NDA?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think if you were to be as transparent as possible, you could indicate that they're being transcribed by a specific, you don't even name the person itself in terms of responsibility, but you may say, we'll go through transcribing purposes. And that's just for transparency purposes overall. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but if you're going to implement sort of data management best practices, why not at least indicate that you use the service to do so? So in my case, I would probably incorporate it, but you don't have to name somebody, just indicate that you use the services themselves.
We've also got a question asking, are there DMP courses for grad students? And if you want to speak to that, I will find a relevant link.
Yes, so there are DMP courses specific for graduate students that they are often held in the fall and spring through the graduate student support services within the library. And there have been recordings where we did one last year specific on developing a data management plan from start to finish, where it was a workshop environment, kind of like what we're working with in the 2 hours later on, but with more specifics around building a plan. So Sarah is going to find the link and share it because there are some available online. So in terms of Daniel, in terms of how thorough, not very thorough. The important thing that we're hoping that you get from it is that you have some level of comfort with the types of questions. And almost more importantly is that you've had that initial discussion, whether it's 30 minutes to an hour with your supervisor to say, hey, here are some of the things that I need to complete from the data management plan and that you need clarity on. So ultimately, we just want you to have a little bit of a familiarity with it. And if you run into any challenges, that you make us aware of them so we can touch on them when we hold the workshop on the 25th. Any other questions that people have?
Another option too is that if you're working with other people in your lab and they're also interested in creating a data management plan or need sort of a guideline and overview, just like what Kevin just shared with us, we are recording this session and it will be shared later on today onto our YouTube channel. And so, and Kevin's past presentations, which cover some of what we covered today, are also available. So on that same website. And so be sure to share those with anyone else in your lab that you think that this would be useful for.
Because we do still have a couple of minutes, there was a question from earlier on in the presentation about managing versions of analyzed files and data, and just how you manage previous versions of analyzed files and data. It's a very more specific question. I don't know if you wanted to speak to it, Kevin, or if this is better suited for a one-on-one chat.
So can you repeat the question one more time, just so I'm...
Yeah, the question was, how do you usually manage previous versions of analyzed files and data? And I think it came up when we were talking about storage, when we were talking about file organization, kind of at that stage.
Right. So there are many different ways that you can manage them. And so some people will, like, I would say the best practice in it, especially for tracking your progress, and this almost gets to what Alana has mentioned around intermediate steps in preparing data, is that rather than just changing the same file over and over again, I know that Microsoft, and if you're using something like Google Sheets, will keep track of that data, that every time something changes in your data, you actually create a new version. And so what your file name could represent in that case is either a new date that indicates that it's a newer version of that file, or what many people will do is put in the file name, the contents, and then a V1 versus V2 versus V3, which would be naming the version of that file. And so anytime you're doing a substantial change or process to your data, I would recommend creating a new file and having it stored so that you can go into your directory and see, okay, there's been 5 or 6 iterations of this single data set, and I've made substantial changes to them each time. And so when it comes to the idea of documenting that, that would be in your README file, right? To show this is what the stages of the versioning is doing, and this is why it's being changed over time. Because otherwise what you do is you have one file that you've been changing for 6 months or a year at a time, and you don't actually get to track how those changes were made. And you can't go back to an earlier version, which means that you've almost lost all of that work in play in case something goes wrong. So a general safeguard is to be creating as many versions as you can and keeping each change independent of one another. That's my recommendation.
And I feel like your response speaks a little bit to Alana's just last question in the chat, which is, can we discuss more examples of how to have distinct steps in preparing data, or clarify that further? So one would be through sort of quite granular versioning, but are there any other ways we can think about what is a step in data preparation or cleaning or analysis, and what's the threshold for, oh, there's been a change to my data and I've done something to it?
Right.
I may have complicated that question.
No, it's a good question, and I want to go back to this slide specifically related to that question, right? So oftentimes what you really want to, again, you want to keep that one raw master data set available to you first. And so what that does is it allows you to decide on, okay, I've got this one data set. What am I going to do with this that's going to require any type of processing? So maybe you're taking a snippet of your data and you want to only look at that one small subset of it. So you might create another file that is a more abridged or condensed version of that data set. Or maybe, as I had mentioned before, the master data set has identifying information in it. And what you need to do is remove any information that might identify a person individually. So you might remove addresses and emails, and that becomes another subset, which is specific to a de-identified version of that data. And so I would say anytime you think you're making any kind of substantive change, that should result in that additional file. And so then from there, you might take that process data and you might clean it a little bit to make it look nicer so that you can build a figure, or you can incorporate it into a specific type of software. And so that might be another file where it's like, well, here's my clean analysis file that I want to share that has all the data underlying the figure I built. And so you want to think of it almost like a scaffolded process where the raw data is this massive piece. The process might be something you've done to clean it. And then the analyze is almost that final product that is representing what you visualized in some way, is another way to maybe distribute it. And there's lots of examples like that, and it's hard to think of them off the top of my head, but I can bring some to the workshop next time too. It's a great question, Lana, so thank you.
I had one thought that I just wanted to, because we're getting all these really excellent questions, and I wanted to reiterate something that Kevin said at the beginning of the session, which is that we've got a full range of levels of experience working with data on this call. So if you're here as part of the SURE program, and this is maybe even your first opportunity that you're going to get this summer to really sort of work with what you think of as data, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what has just happened in this session? That's fantastic. This is all, that's great. That's a great place to be. So there, we've got faculty on the call, we've got undergrad students on the call, we've got graduate students on the call. And yeah, I just thank you everyone for coming and understand that we're all talking with sort of coming from different backgrounds and levels of experience. But this is still meant for you if you're feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, absolutely. And data management at the outset is an overwhelming process, especially if you've never thought about it before. And ultimately, data management are the elements we talked about today are things that you probably all do without thinking about. And what data management is trying to get you to do is to put that down on paper so that it's easily understandable for yourself and so that you don't forget. It's almost like future-proofing your own work to make sure that it's going to be comprehensible. And obviously, knowing that people come from different backgrounds, we have people from linguistics to computer science to engineering to medicine on this call. And so your data is going to look very different. But the principles underlying this should stay the same. So you might not be working with tabular data, but you're still collecting information from somewhere and you're analyzing it in some way. And so documenting what that process looks like goes a long way to improving the interpretability of your research more broadly. So with that in mind, we have a few more minutes if people have more questions. I'm just going to go back to the question page. So hopefully after this process, you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with data management, and you're going to get a lot more experience for those of you in the program when you start to look at that data management tool and get a sense of the types of questions being asked. But for now, I'm just going to pause again and see if you have any last questions. So I'm going to take a sip of water. Thank you, Ellen. I really appreciate it. So I think with that, we'll stay on the call until noon, Saskatchewan time, in case I know there's some people calling from out of province. But I just want to thank you all for your time and attention. And again, if you have questions about the program, about anything you learned today, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be happy to support you and make sure that you feel comfortable in incorporating data management into your work. And thank you, Merle, and for the SURE program generally. And please check out those other classes because there's a wealth of information for you to become upskilled in research as you go through the summer. So thanks again, I really appreciate it. And we'll be on the call for another about 6 minutes, but feel free to enjoy your lunch and have a good afternoon. So
I'm going to stop the recording. What an excellent presentation, Sarah and Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.